Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark Gods Rise, Chapter 24, More Soldiers for the Old One. In the midst of the temple, Reuven Suran felt something like a cold finger touch his shoulder, then spread into a full-handed grip. Snapping his gaze toward it, he saw nothing, but felt a grip like ice on his shoulder. Shrugging it away, he directed another section of soldiers through to what he assumed were the high priest's private quarters. The lit braziers were a testament that something had been going on here. Whether it had been a ceremony or a treasonous meeting of minds, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had been ordered to strip the temple of its wealth as well, and it didn't feel right. Taking those attempting to harm his kingdom, he understood. But taking something dedicated to the service of the chief of gods, a deity of balance and good, that didn't feel right. It didn't feel right at all. Where to, Captain? Reuben snapped the other way to see who spoke. Lieutenant Griezmann had the strong, wiry build of a lifelong soldier, and he carried a sack that jangled and clattered as it was set down before him. As he did, the top gaped, and Reuben caught sight of several gleaming cups and goblets. He thoughtfully eyed a heavy silver candelabrum before gesturing toward the wagons. "Take it to Matthew," he said, "and make sure he catalogues everything properly. I want nothing to go missing." The iciness haunting his shoulders spread across the back of his neck and into his other shoulder. This time it was accompanied by a wave of dizziness, and he passed a hand over his eyes, missing the puzzlement in his lieutenant's eyes as he gathered the sack and slung it back over his shoulder. He'd forgotten agreeing to collecting a few items for themselves and neglecting to have them recorded. The feeling of the man's hand on his shoulder made him jump. "Captain?" Griegsman's voice was full of concern. Reuben blinked, meeting the man's worried gaze. "Sorry?" "Are you all right, sir?" "Fine, fine." Reuben waved him away, wondering at the aching cold running down his back. He took a deep breath and passed his hand over his eyes once more. This time it was a different voice that disturbed him, one more tentative than the last. "Sir? Captain, are you all right?" Reuben opened his eyes again and dropped his hand to the sword at his belt. "Pardon?" One of his younger soldiers stood before him, his brown hair in matted disarray and soot-streaked sweat running down his face. The man's expression was one of worry and concern. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" he asked. "It's just you're looking kind of grey." Reuben nodded and passed his hand over his eyes once more. "I'm fine, soldier. Move along now. Take that sack to the wagons." The man straightened, although the worry didn't leave his face. "Yes, sir." Reuben watched the soldier shoulder the sack and carry it toward the wagons, before allowing himself to rest against the wall behind him. In truth, he wasn't feeling fine at all. Hadn't been since he'd felt that icy touch before directing his men. He looked for his lieutenant. "Griezmann?" he called, surprised to hear his voice rasping in his throat. "Sir?" Griezmann didn't wait to be ordered. He rose from where he was examining the ground around an overturned pedestal and trotted over. Reuben favored him with a grimace, then said, "Take over here. I'll be resting." He looked around, then gestured to a doorway leading to a portico in a courtyard garden. By the fountain. See I'm not disturbed." Griezmann straightened. "Aye, sir." Reuben ignored the worry that crossed Griezmann's face and stalked out the door to the portico and then through the stone arch that led to the quiet of a walled-off garden. The fountain stood at the center, surrounded by grey marble benches and heavy slate flagstones. Herb beds surrounded it, dotted with roses and lavender, and edged with rows of some low-growing silver-leafed thing. Reuben didn't know what it was, but he was sure it had some purpose. Healing, perhaps? Paths divided the space into 4 equal segments, with the fountain at the center, and he snorted at the order he saw around him. Beyond the garden walls, smoke rose from the temple. "Not so orderly now, are we?" he thought, and wondered what Staravan, god of balance, good, and order, thought of the chaos they'd made of his temple. Not that it matters. With the stone arch forming the only entrance, and Griegsman watching it to ensure he wasn't disturbed, Reuven felt safe enough to take a break by the pool. As he passed between the first two quarters, he noticed the garden, despite its well-grown plantings, felt strangely empty. Cold fingers touched his mind, and halfway to the fountain he paused. Something was missing. Something wasn't right. Reuven stopped, tension crawling up his spine as he scanned the garden beds and paths, and noted bare patches of earth or stone pedestals where something should have stood. Statues, he thought. There should be statues in this garden. Where have they gone? For a moment he wondered if his men had already carried them away, then shook his head. Those had not been the king's orders, or had they? He couldn't remember. Why do I feel so tired? He scanned the garden again and was sure of it. There should have been statues. He could tell by the way the bushes and shrubs had been shaped. Each one looked like they'd been made to complement something, and he could almost see the stone forms of animals cunningly placed to seem as though they played or hunted through the shrubbery. Having solved the mystery, Reuben focused again on the stone benches, their curved forms inviting him to sit and rest. He took a step toward one, noting the carefully trimmed cushion bush framing its back. Nice, he thought, his weariness increasing. He took another step and stumbled. Stumbled? Reuben looked down at his feet, but there was nothing on the path he could have tripped on. He reached for the bench, using it to steady himself as he settled onto it. Why did he feel so exhausted all of a sudden? For a moment he just sat, but his skin felt tight and his hands ached. He pulled off one of his gauntlets so he could rub his fingers and froze at the sight of his hand. It was gaunt and touched with grey, and the skin. Gods, what is wrong with me? The skin pulled tight over bone as he watched, and he drew back from it, his shocked gasp rasping in his ears. He yanked the other gauntlet off, dropping it to the ground at his feet, and moaned when he saw his other hand was the same. Maybe it's something I touched, he thought, pushing hurriedly to his feet and staggering toward the pond at the fountain's foot. Finding a still section of water, he leant on another bench and stared at the image of himself in the pool. Now he could see why the young soldier had stopped and asked him if he were all right. His skin was grey and clung to his cheekbones, accentuating the hollows of his eyes and the dark cleft of his forehead. He lifted a hand to touch his face, wincing at its almost skeletal appearance in the reflection. What is wrong with me? He groaned, slumping into the bench beside him. You're dying, a dark voice replied, and when you're dead, you'll still be walking the land of the living and commanding a regiment of men. Reuben looked around, but the garden was as strangely still and empty as before. The voice kept going, coming both from inside his head and somewhere else. And all your men will be as dead as yourself, because you will call them to you here in the garden by Staravan's sacred fountain, and you will touch each one, and I will pour my power through you until each one of them is as dead as you are. Fear lashed through him, and Reuben tried to stand, only to find a great weight pushing him back, then pulling him over to lie full length along the bench. No, he moaned, but the force was relentless, its grip too strong for him to break. The air grew thick in his lungs, and the voice spoke again. Look at me, it commanded. Look well at me and know there is no escape. You will die and live to serve your king, and above all, you will live to serve me as well. Reuben tried to close his eyes, but they remained stubbornly open. Look at me, the voice demanded. Try as he might, Reuben could not stop his eyes from focusing on a dark blot that appeared in the sky above him. He could not move as it drew closer, becoming a great pool of shadow that poured down over him, overshadowing him as it drew the last remnants of life from his flesh and bones. He screamed, and the pool became a dark cloud that laughed and billowed away, leaving him to face Griegsman alone. The man arrived at a run, skidding to a halt when he saw Reuben lying on the bench. "Touch him," the dark voice commanded. "Touch him and serve me well, or you shall know such pain as you have never known before." Reuben turned his head and reached weakly toward his lieutenant. "Help me," he croaked. I feel in need of my tent." Griegsman took a few cautious steps forward, stopping when he was close enough to see how Reuben had changed. "In need of your tent?" he asked, chuckling nervously. "Captain, you look more in need of an undertaker." "Just help me," Reuben snarled, softening his voice with pleading when the man drew back. "Help me, please." Griegsman hesitated once more before coming close enough to crouch beside his captain. "What did this to you?" he asked, worry warring with fear. "Who?" Reuben corrected, gripping the man's arm and pulling him closer. Griegsman startled back, but Reuben held him tight, and the man's worry turned to alarm. Reuben caught a glimpse of himself in the man's frightened eyes and wondered what had made the lieutenant come so close. Not that it matters, he thought, as hunger swept over him. He pulled Griegsman closer, trapping him in the curve of his other arm. The lieutenant bucked against his grip, trying to twist away, but Reuben proved too strong. With an appetite driven by instinct, he opened his mouth and tore out Griegsman's throat, feeling the dark voice's power flow through him. As Griegsman's weight fell across him, he took another bite, feeling his teeth elongate and his jaws widen to accommodate his new needs. His lieutenant's blood flowed like honey or the finest of wines, and refreshed him, even as his new master took the life and terror and strength from his victim's last few breaths. Reuben swallowed the flesh he'd taken and bit again. The third bite was as good as the two that had gone before, and the blood still tasted as sweet. As he opened his mouth for a fourth, he felt the darkness bid him stop and pushed Griegsman's lifeless body from his arms. As it hit the flagstones in front of the bench, he sat up and looked toward the stone arch, relieved when it remained empty. He looked down when Griegsman's body stirred at his feet. The man gave a rasping groan and he rolled over. Reuben gave him a grim smile, observing how the wounds he'd made were closing. Once more the dark presence descended, and this time Reuben watched Griegsman's skin grey and shrivel, healing over the ragged bite wounds to become unblemished. When Griegsman's eyes opened, they burned with hunger. "Feed me," he croaked, and Reuben bared his teeth. "Don't worry," he said, "you will be fed." He raised his voice and called for aid, meeting the young soldier who answered, at the arch. "Captain!" the man exclaimed at the sight of him. "What's—" "No time," Reuben answered, seizing him by the arm and dragging him toward where Griegsman lay. "It's the lieutenant." Together they lifted the stricken lieutenant to the bench, the younger soldier holding him to steady him as Reuben returned to the arch to call a healer. He'd barely reached the entry when he heard the soldier scream, and knew Griegsman fed. When the healer arrived at the arch, Reuben saw his eyes widen in alarm. Giving the man no more time to react, he seized his arm and dragged him into the garden and punched him in the side of his head before he could shout a warning. He half carried, half dragged the man the rest of the way, arriving in time for Griegsman to take another bleeding chunk from the soldier's neck. It was enough for the healer to pull away, but Reuben held him tight, pulling him around so the man could see the feverish hunger in his eyes. Before he could find his voice and cry out in alarm, Reuben was on him, choking him with fingers that had found greater strength in death than they'd possessed in life. Leaving the body of the healer lying on the flags, Reuben ran for the door. "Thieves! Murderers!" he screamed. "Men! Help me!" From beyond the garden he heard sacks being dropped and swords being drawn. "This way!" he cried, signaling his men to the garden. There! He pointed to where the healer lay. With a shout of anguish, the soldier leapt toward the fountain, his comrades running in his wake. Griegsman and the young soldier, now transformed, were waiting. As cries of outrage turned to alarm, Reuben raised his arms to the waiting darkness. He heard the darkness chuckle with pleasure and felt its approval at his cunning and ambition. The cloud descended on the newly arrived soldiers and Griegsman and the youngster, obscuring them from view. When the pair stepped clear of the swirling darkness, they had smiles on their faces and blood on their lips. Stepping over to the healer's body, Reuben waved them over, and together they fed. For some reason, the man's flesh was sweeter than that of the others, but none of them had time to wonder why before their new master demanded their attention. My new servants need to feed, the god informed them. Fetch them their first meal. Reuben rose immediately. Yes, my lord. He gestured for Griegsman and the youth to follow him. Come, we must find flesh for our brothers. Their lips parted to reveal blood-stained fangs before their faces smoothed with a hunter's intent. Moving swiftly from the temple, they approached one of the nearest houses, and Reuben knocked on the door. It was answered by a white-faced woman holding a taper in one hand. She screamed when she saw Reuben's face in the flickering light, screaming again as he seized her wrist. Find who else resides here, Reuben commanded, turning to Griegsman and the youth. They hurried to obey, and soon more shrieks from the house signaled the discovery of the woman's 3 grown daughters and several servants. Reuben smiled as they were dragged before him. He had bound their mother's hands and tied the bindings to his belt. Now he helped Griegsman and the youth do the same with the rest. These will go to the others, he said. Then there will be 7 of us to collect what the rest will need. Their prisoners struggled against their bonds, but Reuben and his men held them fast. Their struggles ceased once they reached the temple garden and while Shiro released his new creations. Between them, they fed 8 more, their torn bodies left among the rest when Reuben led his newly wakened men to fetch the others. From his distant palace, the king watched as some 20 men and women were led into the garden and left to sate the hunger of the newly wakened creatures that were meant to serve him. These would not rise as the others did, but their end had served him well, and their souls would serve the old one even better, having been dragged to his prison, where he would slowly suck them dry.